A respected judge is wrongfully arrested by a police officer who doesn't recognize her, but when he learns her true identity, he's left speechless. What happens next will shake the very foundation of justice. Stay tuned to find out how one woman takes on the system and fights for what's right. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city streets as the evening rush began to wind down. People hurried along the sidewalks, their footsteps echoing in the crisp air. Among the sea of hurried faces, a woman walked with a quiet confidence. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement, each step deliberate, purposeful. Her name was Alexis Carter, and despite her poised appearance, there was an undeniable tension in the air that day, something she couldn't quite shake. Today wasn't just any day, it was a day that would change everything. Alexis had just come from an important meeting at the courthouse and was making her way home when she caught sight of a squad car parked on the corner. As she approached the intersection, she noticed the officer standing near the patrol car. Officer Brian Daniels, a man with a reputation for his rigid and inflexible approach to law enforcement, was scanning the crowd. His sharp eyes seemed to pierce through every pedestrian, evaluating them like a hawk searching for prey. When Alexis reached the corner, she paused for a moment, glancing at her phone for a text from her daughter. The officer's eyes shifted to her, narrowing slightly, almost as if he had spotted something unusual about her. Without missing a beat, Officer Daniels stepped toward her, his hand raised in a gesture that was more commanding than polite. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone flat and authoritative. "I need to see your ID." Alexis blinked, surprised by the abruptness of his request. She glanced at the officer, trying to gauge the situation. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but measured. "I need to check your identification," Daniels repeated, his gaze never leaving her face. His tone was cold, as if he already assumed the worst. "Step aside." A moment of hesitation passed, but Alexis, sensing the hostility in his demeanor, complied. She didn't know what had triggered this interaction, but something about the officer's attitude felt off. She handed him her ID with a calm, composed motion. Officer Daniels scanned the information with little more than a cursory glance before looking up at her again. His eyes were still sharp, but now they lingered with a judgment that was more than just professional suspicion. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, the hint of condescension dripping from his words. Alexis's eyebrows raised, but she kept her expression neutral. "No, I'm not," she replied simply. "I live a few blocks away. Is there an issue with that?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted his stance, eyes still fixed on her, as if trying to place her in some way. His gaze flicked from her face to her attire and back again, as if judging her from the outside in. "You look like you're up to something," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for her to hear. His words, though cloaked in apparent professionalism, carried an unmistakable tone of judgment. Alexis's heart skipped a beat, the slight tension in her chest growing. She had no idea why he was being so suspicious, but she refused to let his unprovoked hostility throw her off balance. She looked him directly in the eye, her voice unwavering. "I'm not sure what you're insinuating, officer, but I'm just heading home after work." His lips curled into a faint smirk, as though he didn't believe her. "We'll see about that," he muttered, pulling out his radio from his belt. "I'm going to need to run this through dispatch." Alexis's pulse quickened, but she stood tall. She refused to let the situation escalate beyond this point. Something about the officer's manner made her feel uncomfortable, but she knew that, as a judge, she had rights, just like anyone else. Still, she kept her composure. As the officer spoke into the radio, Alexis found herself quietly evaluating the situation. Why was this happening? She had been in the public eye before, had appeared in courtrooms day after day, arguing cases, dispensing justice. Her work was well known, and yet, in this moment, she was reduced to nothing more than a subject of suspicion. "Please wait here," Daniel said, his voice carrying an edge now as he stepped back a few paces, eyes still not leaving her. Alexis stood in silence, the tension rising within her. This was a simple misunderstanding, surely, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way this officer was looking at her, something that felt deeply personal, yet completely out of place. Her grip tightened around her purse, her fingers curling slightly as she considered her options. Should she speak up now? Should she demand a reason for this stop? Or should she simply wait for him to finish with his little show of power? The officer's tone, when he finally returned to her, was more clipped, but still far from respectful. "You shouldn't be out here at this time of night," he said, almost as if she had done something wrong merely by existing in his path. "I'm going to have to take you in for questioning." Alexis felt a flash of anger rise within her, but she suppressed it quickly. This was not the time, she reminded herself. "Take me in?" she repeated, her voice now colder than before. "For what exactly, officer?" Before he could answer, Alexis felt a familiar stir in her gut. A sudden rush of clarity, of recognition. She'd been here before, in her courtroom, where she had been the one handing down judgments. And now it was time for her own. "Take me in for questioning," she repeated again, this time with a small, knowing smile creeping across her face. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" The officer looked at her, confusion crossing his face, but his skepticism remained. "I'm asking the questions here," he said, his eyes narrowing. Alexis's eyes hardened, a spark of something deeper igniting within her. She could feel her identity weighing heavy in her chest, the truth bubbling beneath the surface. She was no ordinary woman. And this officer was about to learn just how wrong he was. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. Alexis could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on her, his suspicion still palpable, as though he was trying to figure out what to do with her. She stood there perfectly still, her expression composed, but inside, her mind was racing. How had he so easily dismissed her? She was no ordinary civilian, and this moment was about to take a sharp turn. "I told you I'm just heading home," Alexis said again, her voice steady but firm, holding on to a calm that was becoming more difficult to maintain. "I don't need to be questioned like this." The officer's eyes lingered on her, still dismissive, as if her calmness made her all the more suspicious in his mind. His fingers hovered over the radio again, preparing to escalate the situation further. "We'll see about that," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Alexis wasn't surprised. This was a game he was playing, a game she had seen too many times before in courtrooms, where people were judged by assumptions, prejudice, and bias. But today, the tables were different. Today she wasn't just the woman caught in the middle of a power play, she was the judge, and it was time for him to realize that. "You don't get to decide who I am," Alexis said coolly, her words deliberately slow. "And you don't get to treat me like this." For the first time, the officer paused. There was a flicker in his eyes, a brief moment of uncertainty, as if his mind was processing her words in a way it hadn't before. Alexis took the opportunity, not letting him regain control of the situation. "You've made an error," she continued, her tone calm but sharp, "and it's one you're about to regret." The officer scoffed, shaking his head as if dismissing her. "Error? Lady, you're wasting my time. I don't have time for this." "Maybe you don't have time," Alexis replied, her voice unwavering. "But I certainly do." The officer's hand hesitated over his radio once more, his grip tightening around the device as though weighing whether to call for backup or move forward with his unjust plan. He was clearly rattled, but not enough to back down yet. "I'm afraid you're going to have to wait for further instructions," Alexis added, folding her arms, her voice quiet, but carrying an unspoken authority that only those who had stood in a courtroom for years could understand. "I'm not who you think I am. The officer looked at her quizzically, but this time there was something more than just confusion in his eyes. It was disbelief. His mind was trying to process the calm defiance in her tone, something that didn't match the usual suspects he had dealt with before. Alexis gave him a moment to process, watching as his arrogance slowly began to crack. Finally, she took a deep breath, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "Do you need more identification, officer?" Alexis asked, her eyes locking onto his. "Or do you want to know exactly who you're talking to?" There was a beat of silence, as Officer Daniels still didn't fully understand what she was saying. But something in her demeanor made him pause. She wasn't acting like the typical person caught up in this kind of mess, and that was enough to make him take a step back. "Look, if you're so important," Daniel sneered, "then what's your name?" Alexis straightened, her voice suddenly cutting through the air like a razor. "My name is Judge Alexis Carter. I'm the presiding judge at the courthouse downtown, and you've just made a serious mistake." Alexis's eyes narrowed as she observed him. She could see the internal struggle, the discomfort of someone who had realized just how far off the mark he had been. He wasn't sure if this encounter was going to cost him his job or worse, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't take back what had already been done. "This isn't just about me," Alexis continued, her gaze piercing. "It's about everyone you interact with, the people who trust you to serve them with respect. When you judge someone based on assumptions, based on how they look, where they come from, you hurt everyone." The officer's shoulders slumped as he took in her words. There was no denying it now. The damage had been done. What he had assumed about Alexis, what he had imposed upon her, was not just an error in judgment, it was an act of prejudice that could have had far-reaching consequences. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Daniel said quietly, his voice cracking slightly as the weight of the moment sank in. "I was wrong." Alexis's eyes softened just a fraction. She could see that his apology, though clumsy and insufficient, was sincere. But sincerity alone wasn't enough to make up for the harm caused. "You need to understand that this isn't just about me," Alexis said again, her voice low but commanding. "This is about everyone. You don't get to pick and choose who deserves your respect. It's not just about following the law, it's about doing what's right." The officer nodded, his face now pale with realization. He understood the gravity of the situation. The truth had been laid bare, and all he could do now was face it. "All right," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. "I'll let you go. I won't detain you anymore." But Alexis wasn't done yet. She knew that this moment, this encounter, wasn't just about the officer's apology. It was about holding him accountable. "I'll be filing a report about this," she said calmly, watching his reaction closely. "You may want to prepare yourself for that." Daniels flinched at her words, his face falling even further. His earlier confidence had dissolved completely. This wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding to sweep under the rug. No, this was a matter of accountability. And he would have to face the consequences of his actions. "I understand," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. Alexis nodded once, her expression hardening. "Good. I hope you learn from this, officer." With that, Alexis turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement once more. She didn't look back. There was no need to. The officer's fate had already been sealed, not by her hand, but by his own actions. As Alexis continued down the street, the weight of the encounter still lingered, but her stride remained unwavering. She had done what she needed to do. She had stood up for herself and, in doing so, for the countless others who had faced the same prejudice. But while she was walking away, Officer Daniels was left to grapple with the realization of what he had done. Back at the patrol car, Daniels stood motionless, his hands gripped tightly around the edge of the door, his mind reeling. The quiet city street now seemed distant and foreign to him, every noise louder, more pronounced, as if mocking the discomfort he felt. He had made a decision in that moment, a wrong decision that was now hanging over him like a dark cloud. As he finally gathered the strength to sit down in the driver's seat of his patrol car, he couldn't shake the memory of Alexis's calm, authoritative voice and the crushing weight of her words. The truth was clear. His prejudices had dictated his actions, and those actions had consequences. Just then his radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Daniels, report in," the voice came, sharp and urgent. He took a deep breath before replying, his voice far less confident than before. "This is Officer Daniels. I need to report an incident." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, then a clipped response. "Go ahead." I stopped a woman for questioning. There was a misunderstanding. I treated her unfairly, and she's not just anyone." Daniel's voice faltered as the weight of the truth hit him all over again. He could already feel the consequences of his actions, and the anger from within him now turned inward. "She's Judge Alexis Carter. I tried to arrest her, and I was wrong." Another silence. Then the voice came again, this time with a sharper edge. "You what?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had never felt this vulnerable before. He had always prided himself on his ability to keep control, to command situations. But this was different. This was something he couldn't fix with an apology or a smile. "I didn't realize who she was. I made an assumption about her based on how she looked, and I overstepped. I tried to arrest her when I had no cause. I was wrong." The voice on the other end of the radio softened, but only slightly. "You'll need to file a full report. You're going to be facing some serious questions, Daniels. This could end your career." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always considered himself a good officer, someone who followed the law, who upheld the rules. But now he realized that his actions were a direct contradiction of the very values he had sworn to protect. He had let his own biases cloud his judgment, and now he was going to pay the price. The next day, word spread quickly. Daniels was called into the station for an emergency meeting. Alexis, as expected, had filed her report. Her name was now on the tip of everyone's tongue, not just because of the gravity of the situation, but because of the way she had handled it. Her calm, composed demeanor was now being hailed as the mark of someone who truly understood what justice meant, not just as a concept, but as a practice that had to be upheld at all costs. At the station, Daniel sat across from his superior, Captain Stephen Grant. The captain's face was stern, his eyes sharp with disappointment. "So, Daniels," Captain Grant began, his voice measured, but carrying a weight that suggested he already knew what was coming. "You've put the department in a very difficult position." Daniels hung his head, unable to meet the captain's gaze. He had no defense. What could he say? The truth had already been laid bare, and there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. "I didn't think," Daniels muttered, his voice hollow. I assumed she was just another person trying to get away with something." Captain Grant's gaze hardened. "You assumed, officer, and in doing so, you treated a judge like she didn't matter, like she wasn't entitled to the same respect as any other citizen." He paused, letting the silence fill the room. "And let's not forget that she's a public figure, someone who serves the law. You tried to arrest her based on nothing but your prejudices. You violated that trust." Daniels winced at the words. He had always prided himself on enforcing the law, yet now he had become the very thing he had sworn to protect against, a person who abused power based on personal bias. I'll make it right," Daniels said weakly, his voice cracking as the weight of his actions pressed on him. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll go through retraining, work harder, whatever's needed." Captain Grant's face remained impassive. "Retraining won't fix the problem. This goes beyond you simply being untrained. This is about how you've let your prejudices affect your judgment, and now you'll need to face the consequences." The captain leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. We'll be putting you on administrative leave while the department conducts a full investigation. You'll need to file a detailed report about what happened, and if things don't work out—" He let the words hang in the air, unfinished but clear. Daniels nodded, his chest heavy with dread. "I understand." The words rang hollow, but there was no escaping the reality. He had crossed a line, and now he would have to pay for it. Back at the courthouse, Alexis had already moved on from the incident. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford to be bogged down by the actions of one misguided officer. But she knew that her report and the ripple effects from this encounter would make a difference. She had exposed a problem, and in doing so, she had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for the people who could not always stand up for themselves. As she walked through the courthouse halls, her colleagues greeted her with respect, nodding in acknowledgment of the courage she had shown. The whispers of admiration followed her as she entered the courtroom, ready to continue with her day's work. But in the back of her mind, she knew that change had already begun. It had to. And it wasn't just about her. It was about holding people accountable, holding the system accountable. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, she had made the world a little bit better. The days following the incident were a whirlwind. While Alexis continued with her daily responsibilities as a judge, the news of what had transpired between her and Officer Daniels spread quickly. The story took on a life of its own, fueling discussions about racial prejudice, authority, and accountability. At first, the reactions were mixed. Some stood by Alexis, praising her for keeping her composure under pressure and holding the officer accountable. Others, however, were less sympathetic. There were whispers, some questioning whether she had overreacted, while others suggested that she was simply using her position for leverage. But as the story gained traction, so did the public's understanding of the deeper issues at play. Social media exploded with debates over the officer's actions. People from all walks of life began to share their own experiences with prejudice, some recounting stories of being unfairly treated by law enforcement based solely on their appearance, race, or gender. Alexis read some of the comments, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this issue was not isolated to her. It was a systemic problem. The prejudice and assumptions people faced daily were much larger than any one officer's mistake. Late one evening, as she sat at her desk reading through her case files, Alexis received an unexpected message. The name on the screen caught her attention: Chief of Police, Michael Dawson. She had worked with him a few times during her career, but they weren't exactly close. She hesitated for a moment before opening the message. It was short but direct. Judge Carter, I would like to request a meeting with you regarding the incident with Officer Daniels. Please let me know a convenient time. I believe we need to discuss this further. Alexis set her phone down, her thoughts racing. A meeting with the chief of police could go many ways. Would it be a genuine conversation about addressing the broader issues of prejudice and reform within the force? Or would it be an attempt to smooth over the situation and protect the officer involved? She wasn't sure, but she was prepared to stand her ground. The next morning, Alexis entered the police headquarters, her heels clicking with confidence on the marble floors. She was met by a receptionist who directed her to the chief's office. As she walked down the hall, she noticed the officers stationed at desks, working silently. A few of them glanced up as she passed, their expressions unreadable. When she reached Chief Dawson's office, the door was already slightly ajar. Alexis knocked lightly before entering. The chief stood up as she walked in, offering her a polite handshake. "Judge Carter," he greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you for meeting with me." "Of course," Alexis replied coolly, shaking his hand. "What's this about?" The chief gestured for her to sit. As Alexis settled into the chair across from his desk, she could sense the tension in the room. Dawson seemed uncomfortable, but he was trying to maintain control. "I wanted to personally apologize for Officer Daniels's actions," the chief began, his voice steady but measured. "What happened was inexcusable. The department is taking it very seriously." Alexis raised an eyebrow, not entirely convinced by his words. "Is that so?" Dawson nodded, his expression now more earnest. "We've already begun an internal investigation. Daniels has been placed on administrative leave while we look into the incident further." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what happens after that? Will he be held accountable, or will this just be another slap on the wrist?" The chief's expression faltered, and Alexis didn't miss the brief moment of hesitation. "I understand your concerns," Dawson said carefully, "but you must understand this isn't something that can be resolved overnight. We need time to conduct a thorough review of his actions and ensure due process." Alexis crossed her arms. "And what about the broader issue? Officer Daniels didn't act in a vacuum. His prejudices are indicative of a much larger problem within the force. Are you prepared to address that?" Dawson's lips tightened, and, for a moment, he seemed to shrink under her gaze. "We are committed to reform," he said, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "The department is undergoing sensitivity training, and we're working to ensure that every officer adheres to the standards we set forth." "I hope that's more than just lip service," Alexis responded, her voice calm but resolute. "If you want real change, it's going to take more than a few workshops and a handful of apologies." Dawson's gaze met hers, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. "I agree," he said softly. "But it's a start." There was a long pause between them, as if each was waiting for the other to make the next move. Alexis could feel the tension growing, but she refused to back down. She had a responsibility to her community, to the people who relied on the justice system to protect them, not just when it was convenient, but always. "I'll be keeping a close eye on this," Alexis said, standing up. "If you truly want change, I expect to see it. I won't let this slide, and I won't stop pushing for accountability." Chief Dawson stood with her, his posture a little more rigid now, but he nodded. "Understood, Judge Carter. I promise you, we'll take it seriously." As Alexis left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation had been just that. Words, promises made without real action behind them. But she knew that now, more than ever, she couldn't afford to be silent. She would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been judged based on nothing more than the color of their skin, their gender, or their appearance. The days that followed Alexis's meeting with Chief Dawson were filled with tension. As expected, the investigation into Officer Daniels' actions was making headlines, and public opinion was split. Some viewed Alexis as a champion of justice, standing up to the prejudice within the police force. Others, however, criticized her for what they perceived as overreacting, suggesting that her status had shielded her from accountability, or worse, that she was using her position as a weapon to target a single officer. Social media exploded with debate. People from all walks of life shared their opinions, and it wasn't just about Officer Daniels' actions anymore. It was about the larger systemic issues that plagued the justice system. Hashtags like Justice for All, End Prejudice, and Accountability in Action flooded platforms, each tweet, post, and comment weighing heavily on the minds of those involved. Alexis had expected this. She had always known that standing up for what was right, especially in a case like this, would draw attention, both positive and negative. But it was the negative comments that gnawed at her. She had received personal messages, some from strangers, others from colleagues, questioning her actions. "Why didn't you just let it go?" one message asked. "You're just making it harder for the rest of us," another read. The more she saw, the more she realized how deeply ingrained prejudice was in every facet of society. It wasn't just one officer who had wronged her. It was a symptom of a much larger issue. The pressure to stay quiet, to not rock the boat, was strong, but Alexis wasn't one to back down. Late one evening, while scrolling through her phone, she noticed a comment from an old acquaintance, a fellow judge, Michael Larkin. His words stood out in the midst of all the noise. "You've done the right thing, Alexis. Keep fighting. If we don't speak up, who will? Stay strong." For the first time in days, a small smile tugged at the corners of Alexis's lips. It was a reminder that even though the path was difficult, she was not alone. Others were watching, others were listening, and others were fighting for the same ideals. This wasn't just about one officer, it was about creating lasting change. The media frenzy didn't die down. Instead, it grew louder, reaching a fever pitch as the investigation continued. The city's mayor, already under pressure to address the issue of police misconduct, was forced to release a statement. "We do not condone the actions of Officer Daniels. We are committed to addressing this situation and ensuring that those who serve the public do so with respect, fairness, and professionalism," the mayor's statement read. "We will work with community leaders, including the judiciary, to implement better training and hold those who violate the law accountable." The mayor's words were diplomatic, but Alexis wasn't impressed. They were safe. There was no mention of how systemic issues needed to be addressed, no indication that the real problem, prejudice within the system, was being tackled head-on. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. It wasn't just the public or the mayor who were paying attention, it was the police force itself. Officers began to speak in hushed tones when Alexis entered a room, and there were murmurs of discontent among the department. Some of them felt she was overstepping, others that she was stirring up trouble where none was needed. But one thing was clear: Alexis was no longer just a judge in a courthouse. She had become a symbol of resistance, a voice that wasn't going to be silenced. The night before the next round of hearings, Alexis was at her desk, reviewing the case files when her phone buzzed with another notification. She glanced at the screen. This time, it was a message from her daughter, Melanie. "I'm proud of you, Mom. Keep pushing for what's right. The world needs more people like you." Alexis's heart warmed. Melanie had grown up watching her mother face difficult cases, often knowing the stakes were high. But now seeing her own daughter's support was different. It was the support of a generation that was starting to demand real change. But the weight of the situation was still heavy. She knew the storm wasn't over. There was still the matter of Daniels's fate. Would he be dismissed? Would he face real consequences? She had no doubt that the department would try to protect him in some way, to avoid the embarrassment of a high-profile dismissal. And if that happened, Alexis was ready to take the next step. There was another message on her phone. This one was from her lawyer, Jason Monroe, who had been guiding her through the legal aspects of the situation. "Alexis, we may need to consider taking legal action if the department doesn't hold Daniels accountable. I know you don't want to go that route, but we may not have a choice. Let me know when you're free to talk." Alexis sighed and rubbed her temples. She had known that this was a possibility, but she hoped it wouldn't come to this. She had made her stance clear. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about an entire system that needed reform. And if that meant taking legal action to ensure accountability, then so be it. But for now, Alexis focused on the hearings ahead. The work didn't stop, even as the outside world continued to buzz. She would show up, do her job, and continue pushing for what was right, no matter the obstacles. The following weeks were filled with tension. Alexis continued to do her work as a judge, but the weight of the situation hung over her like a dark cloud. The case involving Officer Daniels had not only become a public spectacle, it had also begun to ripple through her personal life. Friends, family, and even colleagues in the legal community had reached out to her with a mixture of support and concern. The story had become national news, with discussions about police conduct and racial bias taking center stage. Everywhere Alexis went, she felt the gaze of the public on her. The whispers, the questions. People wanted answers. Some admired her for standing up to the officer, others questioned her motives, wondering if she was pushing the issue too hard. But what struck her most was the silence from the police department. While public statements had been issued, the actions behind those statements seemed to be moving at a snail's pace. A sense of frustration gnawed at her as the days passed. It wasn't just about Daniels anymore, it was about the systemic issue of prejudice that ran deeper than any one officer's mistake. Alexis knew that the department was dragging its feet, hoping the media storm would die down and the issue would be forgotten. But Alexis wasn't the type to let things slip through the cracks. She couldn't. She had hoped the department would act swiftly, that they would take the necessary steps to ensure such behavior wouldn't happen again. But nothing had changed. Daniels was still on administrative leave, and there were murmurs of him being reassigned or quietly placed back into the force. The investigation had slowed down, and it felt as though the system was protecting its own, at the expense of the very people it was meant to serve. One evening, as Alexis sat in her living room after a long day, she couldn't shake the frustration that had been building up. She had spent years in the justice system, upholding the law, fighting for fairness, but now it felt like the system itself was failing her. She picked up her phone and sent a quick text to her daughter, Melanie. "I'm getting tired, Mel. I don't know if I'm making a difference anymore." The reply came quickly. "You are, Mom. Even if it feels like nothing is changing, you're making a difference. People are listening." Alexis set her phone down and leaned back in her chair. Her daughter's words were a reminder that, no matter how difficult the road was, she wasn't alone in this fight. Melanie believed in her, and as long as she had that support, Alexis knew she had to keep going. But as the weeks passed, Alexis found herself at a crossroads. The pressure was mounting, and the whispers in the courthouse were growing louder. She had heard rumblings that the police department was quietly preparing to settle the matter without taking the appropriate action. Some had even suggested that the department would find a way to return Daniels to duty, brushing the incident under the rug. Alexis knew that if she didn't act soon, the opportunity to make a lasting change might slip away. The next day, Alexis was scheduled to preside over a routine hearing. As she entered the courtroom, she could feel the weight of the entire situation pressing on her shoulders. She had to make a decision. Would she continue to push for accountability, even if it meant taking matters into her own hands? Or would she step back and let the system handle it in its own time? As she sat at the bench, her gavel resting in front of her, the courtroom buzzed with the usual energy. Attorneys, witnesses, and defendants filled the room, but Alexis's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't help but think about the hundreds, if not thousands, of cases she had presided over in her career, each one a small battle in the larger war for justice. But now, this one felt different. This one was personal. It wasn't just about the law. It was about the values she had spent her life defending. She looked over at her law clerk, who handed her the next case file. As Alexis flipped through the pages, she noticed a familiar name. The officer who had been caught up in the scandal was part of a case scheduled for the following week. It was a small case, but the officer was listed as a witness. Alexis paused, her fingers hovering over the papers as her mind began to race. This could be it. This was the opportunity to make a statement, not just to the police department, but to the entire legal system. She could call attention to what had happened, not just with Officer Daniels, but with the systemic failure that allowed officers like him to continue serving without consequences. She closed the case file and looked up at the courtroom. The room had quieted, and she could feel the weight of the decision settling over her. What was the right thing to do? Should she act now, risk making enemies, and demand the changes she believed were necessary? Or should she remain silent, hope for the best, and let the system take its time? The choice was clear. Later that afternoon, Alexis called her lawyer, Jason Monroe. "We need to take action," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "I'm not waiting for the department to make a move. I'm filing a motion for a public review of Officer Daniels' actions. If they don't want to address it, I will." Jason hesitated for a moment, then spoke cautiously. "Are you sure? This will bring even more attention, and it might escalate things with the department. It's not going to be easy." "I don't care," Alexis replied, her voice steady. "This isn't just about me. This is about accountability. I've had enough of waiting for them to do the right thing. If I have to make it public, then that's what I'll do." Jason paused, then gave a resigned sigh. "All right, let's get started." As the call ended, Alexis stood up from her desk and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The decision had been made. She wasn't going to let this slip by. She would hold the system accountable, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. Because that was her job, not just as a judge, but as a defender of fairness, dignity, and respect. The motion Alexis filed for a public review of Officer Daniels' actions was approved quickly, but that was only the beginning. As soon as the date was set for the hearing, the media descended on the courthouse. Cameras, reporters, and curious onlookers crowded the hallways, their eyes all fixed on Alexis and the outcome of this highly charged case. The courtroom, usually a place of order and quiet focus, was now buzzing with anticipation. The stakes had never been higher. It wasn't just about Officer Daniels anymore. It was about setting a precedent. About whether the legal system, which Alexis had spent her life working in, would uphold the values of justice and equality. Alexis had been prepared for the scrutiny, but the weight of it all hit her as she entered the courtroom. She walked past the rows of reporters, their cameras snapping at her every step. Their questions were a constant hum in the background, but she blocked them out. She had a job to do. As she entered the judge's seat, her eyes scanned the room. The attorneys, the witnesses, the public, everyone was watching. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every person in the room understanding the gravity of the moment. Officer Daniels was seated near the back of the room, his posture stiff, his face pale with anxiety. He had been summoned to testify, and he knew the pressure was mounting. This wasn't just a routine case anymore. It was his career on the line. His fate, and perhaps his future as a police officer, rested on how the next few hours would unfold. Alexis took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had to maintain control. She had to remain calm and focused, no matter how much the tension in the room pressed on her. As she raised her gavel to call the session to order, the noise from the crowd hushed, and all eyes turned to her. This public review has been called to address the actions of Officer Brian Daniels during his interaction with Judge Alexis Carter, she began, her voice steady and clear. This is a review of the officer's conduct, and we will assess whether the actions taken were in violation of professional conduct and the values we expect from those who serve the public. She paused, allowing the words to settle in. The room was silent, everyone waiting for the next move. "Officer Daniels, please take the stand," Alexis continued. There was a moment of hesitation before Daniels slowly stood and walked to the witness stand. His hand shook slightly as he held onto the edge, his face strained with fear. The eyes of the entire courtroom were on him now, and there was no escaping the reality of his situation. He had to answer for his actions. Alexis watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. She had done her best to remain impartial, but in this moment it was hard not to feel a sense of justice building within her. She had waited too long for this, too long for the system to hold someone like Daniels accountable. "Officer Daniels," Alexis began, her voice calm but firm, "please explain to the court why you approached me that day on the street and attempted to arrest me." Daniels opened his mouth, but his words faltered. He cleared his throat, his voice shaking. I didn't know who you were," he began, his eyes flickering nervously to the audience. "I saw you on the street, and you looked out of place. I assumed you were a criminal. I didn't think... His voice trailed off, and he swallowed hard. The courtroom was still, the only sound coming from the slight tremor in his voice. Alexis watched him, her expression unmoving. "You didn't think?" she asked, her voice sharp now. "Is that your excuse? That you didn't think? That you didn't take the time to ask who I was before you tried to arrest me? That you assumed I didn't belong there?" Daniels flinched, his gaze falling to the ground. He didn't respond immediately. The silence in the room stretched, uncomfortable and heavy. Alexis didn't let the moment pass. "Do you understand now, Officer Daniels, that your assumption was based on prejudice? That you judged me not by my actions, but by your assumptions of who I was based on how I looked?" Daniels's shoulders slumped, and he nodded slowly, his face flushed with humiliation. "Yes, I was wrong." The words were simple, but Alexis could see the weight of them in his eyes. He wasn't just apologizing for a mistake. He was acknowledging the deeper issue at play, the assumptions, the biases, the systemic prejudices that affected how people, especially people of color, were treated by law enforcement. Alexis leaned forward, her voice low but resolute. "This isn't just about one mistake. It's about the mindset that led to it. Officer Daniels, you didn't just make a mistake that day. You acted on your biases, and in doing so, you failed to treat me with the respect I deserve as a human being, let alone as a judge." The room was silent. Even the reporters seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next words. "I understand now," Daniels said quietly. "I can see it. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Alexis didn't immediately respond. She let his words hang in the air, giving them time to settle. This was the moment where accountability was either upheld or swept aside. She turned to the attorneys. "I will make my judgment after the testimonies have been heard, but I want it made clear that Officer Daniels's actions were inexcusable," she said, her voice carrying through the courtroom, "and it is my duty as a judge to ensure that those who fail to uphold the law are held accountable." The air in the courtroom shifted. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Alexis felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Officer Daniels anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, who had ever been judged based on their appearance rather than their actions. It was about justice. As the hearing continued, the room remained thick with tension. Officer Daniels had given his testimony, and Alexis had made it clear that his actions were indefensible. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the attorneys presented their cases, each side taking its turn to argue. But Alexis knew that the most important part of this hearing had already passed. The officer had acknowledged his mistake, and the issue now was what would be done about it. By the time the hearing adjourned for the day, Alexis was exhausted, but she knew the real battle had only just begun. This public review wasn't just a one-time event. It was part of a larger movement, one that would shake the foundation of the justice system itself. It wasn't enough for Officer Daniels to apologize. There had to be real consequences for his actions. As Alexis returned to her chambers, she couldn't help but reflect on what she had heard in the hearing. The officer had admitted that his prejudice had guided his actions, and although his apology seemed sincere, Alexis couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. His acknowledgement of his mistake was a start, but it didn't change the fact that he had assumed she was unworthy of respect. The damage had been done. The media circus outside the courthouse was in full swing. Reporters swarmed the steps of the building, microphones raised, asking questions in a rapid-fire succession. Alexis did her best to ignore the noise, knowing that the next few days would only bring more scrutiny. The fallout from the hearing was inevitable. Whether or not the department would take action against Daniels would be a critical point. Over the next few days, the pressure grew. It wasn't just about Daniels anymore. It was about whether the police department would truly address the issue of systemic racism within its ranks. Alexis knew that if they didn't take immediate action, it would send the wrong message. Then came the news that sent shockwaves through the city. Officer Daniels had been reassigned. He wasn't dismissed, as Alexis had hoped. Instead, he was moved to a different division, one where his duties would be less visible to the public. No disciplinary action had been taken, no suspension, just a quiet reassignment. It was a decision that felt like a slap in the face to all those who had fought for accountability. Alexis knew she couldn't let this go. She had already taken the department to task, but this was the final straw. If the department wasn't going to take real action, she would, and she would make sure the public knew about it. The moment the news broke about Officer Daniels's reassignment, Alexis knew she had to act. She couldn't let the department sweep this issue under the rug, not when so many people were depending on her to stand firm. The truth was clear. Daniels hadn't just made a mistake. He had made a choice based on his own biases, and that choice had consequences. And now, those consequences were being ignored. That night, Alexis sat alone in her office, reviewing the details of the case. She read through Daniel's testimony once again, her mind racing with the implications of his reassignment. He had admitted to being wrong, but the system had failed to hold him accountable. The apology was hollow if there was no real consequence to his actions. She couldn't let that slide. The system had failed, and it was up to her to fix it. She drafted a letter, one that would shake the foundation of the police department. It wasn't just a letter of complaint. It was a call for action, a demand that Daniels face real consequences for his actions. She wrote it carefully, her words precise, outlining how the failure to discipline Daniels was a disservice to the community, to the people who trusted the justice system to protect them. Once she had finished the letter, Alexis knew she had to go public. She couldn't just send it to the department and hope for change. The world had to know what was happening behind the scenes. So she called a press conference. The next morning, cameras flashed as Alexis stepped up to the podium, her gavel in hand. The room was packed with reporters, their pens poised and microphones raised. She stood tall, her posture unwavering. The pressure was immense, but she couldn't afford to let it show. "Good morning," Alexis began, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here today to address the issue of systemic prejudice within the police department. It has been weeks since Officer Brian Daniels tried to arrest me without cause, based solely on his assumption of who I was. Since then, there has been an internal investigation, and the results are clear. Officer Daniels has not been held accountable for his actions." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Instead of facing disciplinary action, Daniels has been reassigned, moved quietly to a different division where his actions won't be as visible. This is not justice. This is an attempt to cover up what happened, and it is unacceptable. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Officer Daniels admitted that his actions were driven by prejudice. He admitted that he judged me not based on my actions but on how I looked. But the department has failed to take meaningful action. This is a failure of the system, and it is a failure of the leadership within the department. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. "I will not stand by and allow this to go unchallenged," Alexis continued, her voice steady with resolve. "If the department will not hold Officer Daniels accountable, then I will take the necessary legal steps to ensure that justice is served. No one is above the law, not the police, not anyone. I will not rest until the system is held accountable for the actions of those who abuse their power." The room was still, the reporters processing her words. Then, one reporter stood and raised his hand. "Judge Carter, are you planning to take legal action against the department?" "I'm not ruling anything out," Alexis replied, her eyes locked on the reporter. "If the department will not act, I will. And I will make sure the public knows about it." As Alexis walked away from the podium, the cameras continued to click, the reporters shouting questions that she didn't answer. But she didn't need to. She had made her point. The ball was now in the department's court, and if they didn't act, Alexis was ready to take it to the next level. She wasn't just a judge, She was a force of change, and she wasn't going to stop fighting for justice. The days that followed Alexis's public statement were a blur. The media continued to report on the hearing, on Officer Daniels's reassignment, and on Alexis's determination to hold the system accountable. The pressure on the police department to act was mounting, but despite the growing public outcry, they refused to budge. Officer Daniels remained in his new position, and the department's leadership continued to offer vague reassurances that they were addressing the issue. But Alexis wasn't satisfied with vague promises. She had already made it clear that if the department wouldn't take action, she would. And, true to her word, Alexis and her legal team began preparing for what would become a landmark legal battle. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about holding a system of power accountable for the wrongs it had allowed to persist unchecked. As the preparations for the case began, Alexis felt a mixture of determination and unease. She had no illusions about how difficult the road ahead would be. The police department had powerful resources, and they would do everything in their power to protect one of their own. But Alexis knew the truth. She knew that the system couldn't continue to ignore the problem of prejudice, and she wasn't going to let them hide behind their bureaucracy any longer. Her legal team worked tirelessly, combing through case files, researching precedent, and drafting legal arguments. It was a fight that would drag on for months, perhaps even years, but Alexis knew it was a fight worth fighting. She wasn't just doing this for herself or for Officer Daniels. She was doing it for everyone who had ever been judged by their appearance, who had been treated unfairly simply because of how they looked. The first day in court was like no other Alexis had experienced. The stakes were higher than ever before. She took her seat at the bench, her heart steady but her mind racing. Her legal team was ready, and they had the evidence on their side. Officer Daniels' prejudice was undeniable, and the department's failure to hold him accountable spoke volumes about the systemic issues at play. But it wasn't just about winning. It was about sending a message that would be heard beyond the walls of the courtroom. As Daniels took the stand, his face pale and his hands shaking, Alexis watched carefully. The man who had once been so confident in his role as an officer now seemed like a broken figure, his arrogance replaced with guilt and fear. He had already admitted his wrongdoing in the public hearing, but now, under oath, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. "I didn't think," Daniels said, his voice trembling as he recalled the day of the incident. I saw her, and I made assumptions. I assumed she didn't belong, and I was wrong." Alexis listened intently, her gaze never leaving him. His words, though remorseful, were far too late. The damage had been done. The case continued with both sides presenting their arguments. Alexis's legal team relentlessly laid out the facts, showing how Daniels's actions were not just a mistake, they were a direct result of the bias that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. But the defense, representing the police department, fought back with everything they had. They argued that Daniels's actions were a result of a misunderstanding, that he had acted with good intentions. They claimed that no harm had been done, and that the department had already taken corrective measures. But Alexis knew better. She had seen firsthand how the system protected its own, how it would turn a blind eye to the actions of its officers, no matter the harm they caused. This case wasn't just about Officer Daniels. It was about dismantling that system piece by piece. In the end, the judge in the case rendered a verdict that sent shockwaves through the entire city. Officer Daniels was found guilty of misconduct and racial profiling. The police department was ordered to pay damages, and a new program for police reform was mandated to address the systemic issues of racial bias within the force. It was a victory, but it was just the beginning. The legal battle was over, but the ripple effects of the case were just beginning to be felt. Officer Daniels was dismissed from the force, and the department was forced to make sweeping changes in its policies and training programs. Alexis knew that this was just one small victory in the larger fight for justice, but it was an important one. The message had been sent. Prejudice would no longer be tolerated, and accountability would be demanded, no matter who was involved. But for Alexis, the victory wasn't just about the case, it was about the impact it had on the community. As she walked through the courthouse halls in the days that followed, she felt a new sense of purpose. The voices of those who had been wronged, those who had suffered in silence for too long, were now being heard. The fight for justice was far from over, but it was a fight worth having. The department's reforms, which Alexis had pushed for, were put into place. New policies were enacted, and mandatory diversity and inclusion training became a core part of police officers' education. Officers were required to undergo regular evaluations to ensure they were not acting on biases or making assumptions based on race, gender, or appearance. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. As Alexis sat at her desk in her office, reviewing the final details of the case, her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter, Melanie. "I'm proud of you, Mom. You did it. You made a difference." Alexis smiled to herself as she read the message. Her daughter was right. It wasn't just about winning in court, it was about creating change, about showing the world that standing up for what's right was always worth the fight. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to fight. But Alexis was ready. She had learned something powerful through this experience, that justice, though often slow, was always worth pursuing, and as long as she had the strength to stand, she would continue to fight for fairness, for dignity, and for the belief that everyone deserved to be treated with respect. And that, she knew, was a fight worth fighting.